Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and Classics Week is over. With this week closing, I figure it's a good thing to sort of think about, reflect on, sort of discuss what exactly a classic in music is. What's the criteria? What makes for a classic album? To discuss this pertinent issue, I brought in Joel over at The Daily Guru, another music-related YouTube channel, and Myke Seatown, who you might know as one of the reviewers who participates in the biggest YouTube hip-hop reviewing channel, Dead End Hip Hop. Transition! And here we are, magic of the internet, webcams. The three of us don't really favor the idea of there being rules in music, but really should there be a criteria for what makes for a classic?
I don't think you can. I mean, what are you going to say that even within an artist-specific catalog, a lot of people, like, let's just take the Rolling Stones, for example. A lot of people will say that Exile on Main Street is their classic album. Well, what about me? I happen to think that Let It Bleed is the best Rolling Stones album that there is.
Couldn't you have technically more than one classic album in your discography?
Yeah, definitely.
Most definitely. I mean, of course those two Stones albums that you just brought up are fantastic. And I think, at least in my personal definition of a classic, they both make that cut. There are artists out there with numerous classics. There's no reason to sort of, just give one single album in their entire discography to give just one album that label. I mean, to me, and we could talk about the time frame, but at least to me, a classic over a certain time frame maintains at least a certain level of influence or relevance.
I want to kind of comment on what Joel said a minute ago. I don't necessarily think that in order for an album to be classic, it needs to be your favorite album. Like, there are lots of albums that I don't even personally care for, but I would never say that they're not classic albums. Like, I'll go on record as saying I'm not the biggest fan of Death. I'm not the biggest fan of their album Human. But that album is clearly a classic album because it ushered in a certain sound to the genre, right?
No, definitely. That's also a record, and that's also a band that you could take that record and then name dozens of other records that have sounds that are very much alike to it. So, no, I mean, you personally don't have to like an album for it to be a classic. I mean, I think the definition of a classic is just, slightly more objective than that. But what I think is something that we could talk about now is how long exactly does something need to maintain that kind of popularity?
I mean, I think if you're talking about a classic, it has to be something that's going to stick for the long term. I don't think it can kind of show up for a little bit, be classic, and then kind of just disappear. I do think it's kind of a lifelong label that an album has to earn. Its relevancy may change, but like you look at something like the first Three Stooges albums and how important they were to punk rock. A lot of people don't go back that far anymore. They stop at the Pistols and the Ramones, and they don't dig back to early Velvet Underground and stuff like that. But they're still classic records, even though they may not be. People may not realize it as much anymore.
When there comes a day that we're not hearing albums that sound directly influenced by the Velvet Underground, we still won't be able to deny that album, any of their albums, as classics because its ripple effect had been had. And obviously, we wouldn't be where we are if those albums hadn't come out. So, I mean, at least for me personally, there has to be a certain, and I don't know what the number is, but there has to be a certain age of an album for it to be a classic. At least for me, I think like a generation is a good standard. If an album has been able to maintain relevance over the course of a generation and had a significant ripple effect, and you can sort of see a hierarchy or maybe a family tree of different artists that album has influenced over time, then yeah, sure, name it a classic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing that now where, at least for the three of us, are guessing our general age range right now, where we see things like Wu-Tang's 36 Chambers or, the early Nirvana or Pearl Jam starting to be referenced with that term, like classic and groundbreaking and stuff like that. So it's what? Most of those records are about 20 years old now, and again, it's that generation.
I don't really know if this is something that transcends hip-hop, but it seems like hip-hop is one of the only genres that's quick to label something that just came out yesterday a classic. You know, like I don't hear that happen really in punk. I don't hear it happen in indie rock. I don't hear it happen in metal. But like for instance, Good Kid, Mad City.
Sure.
You know, people are already calling that a classic, and it just came out. You know, everybody else classic means that it impacted a genre, it redefined a genre, and like you said, Anthony, it has to age a little bit. With hip hop, it's just like, oh, we really liked it, so therefore it's a classic.
I mean, you know, maybe that's because of a few different factors. I mean, I feel like especially in hip-hop, the influence of a new sound or a new trend is just heard instantaneously. Like, you know, it's the explosion, the spread of ideas, in my opinion, in hip-hop is so much more explosive, you know, violently explosive. And, you know, in a really interesting way, you know, the influence of what Kanye did on My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy was heard the very next year.
For some reason, within punk and hardcore, you don't see that term used very often, aside from, you know, Nevermind the Bollocks, the first Ramones record, and, you know, a handful here and there. But, you know, that first Minor Threat record is really the birth of hardcore music in the United States. And, you know, even now, you won't hear anyone say that. And that record was, what, about 33 years ago. So, you know, with the stuff we're seeing today, you know, whether it's Kendrick Lamar or even the Orange album, I mean, they may be forgotten by people who weren't there then, but, you know, that's where kind of the historians come in and say, well, this is actually where that began.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and, you know, and maybe that's why that discussion isn't so heavily debated, and maybe words like classic aren't thrown around as much in punk because, you know, sort of the godfathers and so on and so forth are so clearly established.
I definitely think that there's certain people and certain albums that are almost so obvious that you don't name them classic until somebody brings it up. Like an album like Minor Threat or the first couple Sex Pistols records, or in my opinion, I mean, I think I may have grown up in a different era or a different side of hardcore than maybe you guys did, but for me, it was like the Judge record, or the first Bold record, or Can't Close My Eyes, Youth of Today, or the Firestorm EP. Like, those were all classic records to me. But someone that didn't grow up in that side of hardcore might not even see that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be some level of subjectivity that's going to weigh in for everyone, because again, it is that, you know, unique upbringing where you're like, you know, for me, maybe just grabbing it out of the thin air, you know, Tori Amos's Boys for Pele record had such a significant impact with me in my youth that was a classic moment from my life. You know, that to me gets up there with those other records, but if you look kind of at the lineage of history, nobody's going to see that as a classic album.
I feel like influence and relevance can be two tricky things, and I don't know if you need to have both to have a classic, or if you can have just one or just have the other, because they're definitely
I don't think that they have to have, you know, huge sales numbers. You know what I mean? I don't think you can have
sales numbers, but I mean, you're obviously influencing other artists because they're jacking your sound.
Well, you know, yeah, if you look at it quietly, I mean, especially just because it's easy to keep going back to kind of that whole late 70s New York City scene, whether you're looking at the first few Talking Heads records that took a while to catch on, whether you're looking at something like Television's Marquee Moon, that is a phenomenal record to those who know it and had massive impact, or again, looking at that first Ramones record that did not sell anything until you're well into the 80s. Yeah. And, you know, even in his later years, you know, you could see interviews with Joey Ramone. You know, the Ramones never really got big. They just didn't. And yet, you know, again, that first Ramones record is such a groundbreaking moment.
An album that instantly comes to mind when I think about that is, look at an album like Luke the Drifter, right? That album, to me, is a classic, and it may not be something that translates time, and obviously it sounds extremely dated, but if you look at what was done on that album, the story of being a drifter, the narrative of that album, that influenced generations all the way until now, and that album came out in the 50s, you know? I don't think that an album has to be timeless, or like you said, has to sell a lot of units, move a lot of numbers. It just has to influence the genre, and not just for 5 minutes, for a long period of time. and I don't even hear very many people talk about. And that's one of my favorite Hank Williams records. And it sounds like shit. It sounds like complete dog shit. But it's still a fantastic album.
Yeah, well, I think we just saw that kind of coming full circle with, what is it, Billy Joe Armstrong and Norah Jones doing that Foreverly record, where, they covered track for track. What was it? What it was, Songs Our Daddy Taught Us came out in like 58 or something, and the fact that not only did those two come together, and you'd be hard-pressed to find two people on, further ends of a musical spectrum, but that they're going to, that they both found that common ground in this record that honestly not a lot of people knew of until a year ago. I think then you can say, okay, well, is that a classic record then, because it had such an interesting influence?
I think we can leave it at that. Obviously a classic, a little more objective than a favorite, and it's got to hold some water over time. It's got to prove itself to have shelf life. It can't just be a really quick in and out. In terms of its popularity, and especially in terms of its influence. I mean, you could have short-term or no popularity, like we were just talking about with lack of album sales, but influence, in my opinion, is really, and long-term influence is really what's key to having a classic record.
Well, and I think you also need to find something that's a little more universal. It has to have reached a large number of people.
But is it really the record itself that needs to reach a large amount of people?
No, I think it's the band.
Idea or the sound.
Yeah, the sound.
All right.
Yeah, I agree with that totally.
All right then. Thanks for coming on. Again, Joel from the Daily Guru, Myke over at Den and Hip Hop, talking about what makes for a goddamn classic.
Classics.
Classics. All right. See you guys later. I'm sure we'll talk again.
All right, man.
Forever.